guys, so today I'm here to talk about the relationship between calcium, vitamin D, phosphorus and vitamin K2. And we know with rats that calcium and vitamin D are two of what we call the big three, the micronutrients that it's quite difficult to get from standard rat diet, and a little bit of thought needs to be given. Now, in all the pre-prepared manufactured food and blocks, these are just added as vitamin and mineral supplements. But somebody on the Scuttling Gourmet page has raised the question about getting these micronutrients from food. And this is perfectly possible. It just takes quite a bit of care and attention. So today we're looking at that concept, and I'm just going to run through some of the key points, and then I'll be adding a recipe that will support some of this. So we'll look at calcium first. Calcium is available in a lot of foods in relatively small amounts. There's good amounts in green leafy vegetables such as kale and spinach, collard greens. But the calcium in greens is actually quite hard for the body of a mammal to extract. This is true for rats and for humans, and it's actually absorbed at a fairly low rate, sometimes as low as 10%. And this is because of other anti-nutrients in the food, particularly oxalates, which bind with the calcium, and that prevents it from moving across the gut wall into the bloodstream. So kale fares best between the three that I mentioned, while spinach and collard greens have more oxalates, therefore there's less calcium available to absorb into the body. However, there's no way that a rat could eat enough kale to get the amount of calcium that they need to keep them healthy and their bones strong. Calcium has many roles in the body, but that's the one that we're particularly thinking about today because of its relationship to these other vitamins and minerals. So if we look at calcium absorption, it's actually important to have vitamin D available for calcium to be absorbed in the gut. It doesn't have to be present in the same food at the same time, but it does need to be available in the body in large enough quantities to be present in good quantities in the gut to help calcium be absorbed. There's another interaction happening at the other end when calcium is needing to be pushed into the bones. So calcium can't move there on its own, and it relies on a hormone called osteocalcin. So vitamin D is necessary again at this point because it is responsible for releasing the oxycalcin, and then vitamin K2 comes in because it activates osteocalcin. Once that's happened, the osteocalcin moves the calcium into the bones. There's also a relationship with phosphorus and calcium, which tend to be related in the proportion of each in the body, but we won't be looking at that today because phosphorus is essentially present in pretty much everything that rats eat in good quantities, so it's never an issue where it's needing supplementation. There is an issue with phosphorus, but that's a completely different subject where rats' kidneys are beginning to become damaged, and then phosphorus needs to be considered. So looking at which foods we can reach for if we want to top up these micronutrients. Now, luckily, calcium, vitamin D and vitamin K are all able to be stored in the body. Vitamin D is in pretty much every cell in the bloodstream, in the liver, throughout the body, and it's used for many body processes. So we don't have the issue of having to always have 100% of what's needed in the daily food. What we can rely on is hits of foods that contain over the recommended daily amount of these micronutrients. So let's look at them individually. Let's look at calcium first. Calcium is found in good amounts in several foods that rats eat. It's found in sardines, and I tend to use just tin sardines and have them in olive oil and just pat them off to remove excess oil. So these are really easy to use. They've got other advantages in as much as that they give other nutrients that are important, such as selenium, omega-3 fatty acids and vitamin B12. So if rats had about 10 grams of sardines, that would equate to about 40% of the recommended dietary allowance. I'm not going to talk here about the details of the dietary allowance. All of that information is recorded in my book, The New Scuttling Gourmet, for every micronutrient. But for the purposes of this video, it's more about thinking about which foods to use. So if we wanted to give calcium in a large amount, then this is what I would be using. Something like a chicken drumstick, a chicken thigh that's still on the bone, and then just cook this up in some kind of brothy soup that the rats will love. So I'm going to do a recipe in a different video for this type of soup, but it's very flexible, and essentially I would be looking at it to put in some kind of legumes, lots of vegetables and green leafy vegetables, and some herbs, maybe some garlic, and you can put some grain in as well. So barley's good in soups, but any grain could go in too. And then cook it slowly over a long period of time. The meat will just fall away from the bone and can just be squished up so that it's distributed throughout the soup, or you can just whiz the whole soup once you've taken the bones out. Depending on how long you cook it for, if you put it in a slow cooker, certainly overnight, you would be able to cut through the bone quite easily. Usually what I do is I take the cooked bones and I then just bake them for a little while in the oven to harden them and dry them out again, and they actually then become quite brittle and they're quite easy to break up. But what I do with them, I use this little processor, which is one that just has the attachment that fixes various different attachments onto it. Other foods with calcium in are obviously the dairy foods, so you can feed rats a bit of Greek yogurt or kefir, even better, and we'll come on to why in a minute. And then sesame seeds are actually a good source of calcium, and if you're making anything for your rats cooking wise, tahini is a really good way of getting, I would imagine everybody knows what it is, but it is literally just whizzed up sesame seeds to get beyond the husks. So that's a good way of getting the calcium into the rats, because you're not relying on them eating those tiny little seeds, which some rats seem to object to. But those kind of things are top-up foods. They're not going to supply all of the rats' needs. So you do need to have a mixture of things going on. So including some foods that contain calcium, including daily green leafy vegetables, which I would suggest kale is the best for that. And also some days having the top-up food, which in this case is the chicken bones. Then we have vitamin D, and thankfully vitamin D is also really rich in sardines, so that's why this is a great food generally. It also contains selenium and omega-3s, vitamin B12, and for vitamin D3, the sardines actually contain almost 70% of the recommended dietary allowance for rats. So other foods that contain vitamin D in some amount are other oily fish, so mackerel, salmon, sprats, pilchards, and also eggs and beef liver. If you want to give more than 100% of the recommended daily allowance, this is the way to do it. These are vitamin D enhanced mushrooms. That sounds like something sort of spooky's happened to them, but they haven't been fed anything or injected with anything. It's just that if you expose mushrooms to sunlight, like us, they can produce vitamin D. So these mushrooms have been exposed to UV light because those are the rays that will have that effect. And the mushrooms have made vitamin D. So these mushrooms would provide either a small amount if you were just feeding a little bit of mushroom each day, or a larger hit if you decided to feed a mushroom recipe. Mushrooms, when they've been cooked and liquidized, you can get an awful lot of mushroom into a small amount of fluid. So long as your rats enjoy the taste, which many rats do, then it's definitely something that's worth a try. It's the best food that we've got available for giving an amount that is more than the recommended dietary allowance per day. So can we do this ourselves? Yes, we can. So if you live in a country where you have access to sunlight, then you can make any mushroom vitamin D enriched just by leaving it exposed for 20 to 30 minutes, just on a plate, sliced up, will give the biggest surface area, and just let the sun do its magic. Now, some people say their rats don't like mushrooms, and that's fair enough, but they're fairly easy to hide. You can chop them finely and cook them. They could be cooked in a little bit of olive oil, and it won't destroy the vitamin D, and any vitamin D that leaches into the olive oil will still be consumable, but it will enhance the flavour of the mushrooms for the rat. So if you're really struggling, many rats will take them raw. If you're struggling to begin with, offer small pieces rather than a quarter of a mushroom or something. And same if you're going to cook them, offer them cooked in small pieces first. And once your rats are acclimatized to the taste, you can offer larger pieces. However, it's worth noting that many rats will refuse a food the first time, or sometimes the first couple of times that they meet it. So you have to persevere sometimes with rats to get them to get over that sort of hump of being a bit avoidant of anything new. And then our third micronutrient, which is vitamin K. This one's a bit tricky because the only foods that contain vitamin K2, which is what we need in this instance, are actually animal foods, which contain some, but not a huge amount, and fermented foods, because the bacteria actually produce vitamin K. Rats also have another approach to vitamin K requirements, and that is that they manufacture it in their gut, and of course can make use of that because they do eat their own feces when they need extra nutrients that they know they're low on. So there is always that option as well. But if we're looking at dietary things, by far the best are the fermented soybean foods that have come out of Japan. So natto and tempeh. Now, natto is a fermented soybean that's sort of sticky and slimy, and I've never ever been able to bring myself to buy it because it just makes me feel sick just looking at it. I'm sure rats wouldn't care too much about that, so that's, if you can, that's the place to start. And I noticed that there is now natto powder because of the K2 requirements in humans as well. There is natto powder available from supplement manufacturers, but obviously if you can give them the actual food, it is preferable. So you will find natto in health food shops and places like that, or possibly if you have an Asian supermarket near you. Tempeh is more available, and you can get tempeh in some supermarkets, and it is also fermented soybeans, but it hasn't got the sticky texture. It's more like a clumpy, drier texture, and it comes in a little sort of loaf. I can't see any reason why a rat wouldn't like tempeh. You can cook it to enhance the flavour, and you can cook it in garlic or mint or something that you know that your rats like. But both those foods are going to give close to the full amount of vitamin K that's needed. There is vitamin K1 in plants, so don't get confused, because K1 can't be used in the way that's needed for the activation of the osteocalcin, for calcium to be pushed into the bones. that has to be K2. K2 is also found in beef liver, and I just measured that out. That's about 10 grams of beef liver. If a rat ate 15 grams of beef liver, it would be 100% of their daily needs. That's not a huge amount of food, particularly if you're feeding fresh food. And again, if you whiz up beef liver, it just becomes fluid. So it's actually very easy to hide in other ways. So any food that you're cooking, soups and broths and smoothies and things like that, will all take the fluid beef liver. But what I'm going to do is show you how to make a beef cake, which can then just be fed a chunk a day. Beef liver also gives lots of other nutrients. It will, for instance, give all of the copper requirements for the day. But you shouldn't really overuse it because it's got really high levels of vitamin A in it as well. So what I would suggest is making some liver cakes and using that, but also using some tempeh or a nice sauerkraut or something. I happen to have this, it's not live, it's just a supermarket sauerkraut. But I was thinking about it and thinking it's not so great from the point of view of gut bacteria, although it is quite a prebiotic, so it would still help with gut health for a human or a rat. I should say everything that I'm saying applies to people too, but the bacteria have been present and live up until the point where this was pasteurized or whatever, so that it had a shelf life, and they were making vitamin K. Now the vitamin K isn't going to be destroyed by pasteurization, so that will still contain, if I'm using that for vitamin K2, that will still contain it. And these ones, the sort of supermarket type, are really sort of like quite kind of mild and don't have a massive flavour. But again, some rats are going to accept and some rats are not. So I would say tempeh is the best bet. Or if you're struggling, get the natto powder. It is just freeze-dried natto, which is a presentation that is not problematic for losing lots of micronutrients. But as I say, the K2 is quite robust and would definitely survive the freeze drying. So that's another option, and by far the most easy option. So that's the end of what I wanted to say about the individual ingredients. So I'm just going to move on to making a cake. Okay, so now I'm just going to make some cake. And this is liver cake. I've got about, I think there's between 500 and 600 grams of pasture raised beef liver in there. And then the other things I'm going to put in now, I'm going to use this for dogs, so it's not dissimilar to what I would use, but I'll talk about it. So I'm going to add a little bit of this, which is a really great mix that I've found. Flaxseed, almonds, Brazil nuts, walnuts and CoQ10. This does have some micronutrients on the back. So it's got zinc, copper, manganese, selenium and iron in it. Good levels of magnesium. So that's useful for any living creature, any mammal that eats along the lines of an omnivore. That's the one I'm looking for. So good for any omnivore. And all I'm going to do is just put a sort of dollop in there. That's probably a tablespoon or something like that. There's a heaped soup spoon. There is no tight measuring needed here. I'm also going to put in just some 100% peanut butter. Now, I wouldn't put this in if it was for the rats. I would put in something like the tahini would be more useful, but this is for the dogs, and they can have that. So yes, I would replace that with tahini or even almond butter. Almonds have got good amounts of calcium in them. I'm then going to put in 3 mushrooms and a couple of free-range eggs. I'll put those in first, and I'm going to then do these as the fluidy bits, and then it might be easier to whiz up the mushrooms once I've done this. I'm using a whizzer. I can't call it anything else because I don't know what it's called. So we'll just pop that in. Okay, so then I'm just going to put the mushrooms in. Just do the mushrooms. Right, so now I'm left with a fairly smooth, thick mixture, and I just want to make it up to a cake mixture with some wholemeal spelt flour. Now that can be the same for rats. These are nice flours. It's an ancient grain and it's whole grain flour. So I'm just kind of guessing. I think I'll need more than that, but we'll just stir a bit in first, because as I say, I've got rather too much for the liver for the size of the container. In fact, I'm going to pour it into a bowl. So I'm just going to pour it into a bowl to make mixing easier.